The third and final period of prophecy that we see within the Nevi'im, so to speak, or at least the latter prophets, is the period after the exile. So you remind yourself that in fact the exile starts in 586 BCE, and about 60 years later, so in 524 BCE, is when they are emancipated, when they are now released by Cyrus of the Persian Empire, because of course the Persian Empire has destroyed the Babylonian Empire, and they are given that emancipation. They're released to go back to the Holy Land and go back and rebuild their land, to go back and reestablish their cultural heritage and their connections. So Cyrus was a very enlightened, or at least the Persian Empire was much more enlightened as a community, to allow them to go back and to do that and to worship their own gods in their own land. And in fact, we can read in the book of Ezra, for example, the story of some of that and so what happened, where they were sent back even with all the various plates and bowls and so on which had come out of the temple, which had been taken by Nebuchadnezzar, by the Babylonians in 586. So what happens is that the prophets go back as well. And there's three main prophets that deal in this period. This what you can call the post-exilic prophets, or after the exile. The three main ones is Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi. Malachi or Malachi. And these three all are speaking about what do we do now? How do we connect with what we do now? Zechariah's main theme is saying it's because we weren't doing the right thing, because we weren't pure in the past, that's why we ended up in exile. We need to follow the law. We need to do the right thing. We need to be the people of God. And in many ways, it's that theme that you could imagine for the 60 years of exile has been going through all the Judeans' minds. They've been thinking, how did we end up here? We're the chosen people of God. We're the people that God chose to be His. How did this happen to us? And of course it can't be God, because God is completely good. And if God is completely good, then it must be us. We must have done it. We did it to ourselves. And so what you see is that theology begins to develop about saying that it was them. And so therefore, if they can be more pure, then they won't have that happen to them again. They won't go through the suffering and the pain. And I always find that so interesting, because in many ways the way in which to remain pure was all seen about how to obey the rules. And yet the funny thing is that as we see by the time of Jesus, that those Pharisees who are obeying the rules are the ones who come in for the greatest criticism by Jesus. Because what they had forgotten was just obeying the rules for the sake of obeying the rules misses the whole point. The reason why we obey the law is not because we are afraid of punishment or exile. We obey the law because the law is what brings us blessing and order in the midst of the chaos. They didn't see that. They missed it. And that's why even in the book of Zechariah, you see that they miss it as well. They miss God's intent. They miss God's connection. You know, when we read these books, let's not read them uncritically. Let's read them with a critical eye, realizing that they made mistakes. Places like Haggai and even Zechariah are thinking that the Messiah has come in certain people, only to realize that in fact that wasn't true. They made mistakes. And in fact, the Bible is not afraid to put the mistakes into the Bible. They're not afraid to say that in fact in our frailty we make mistakes. David made mistakes. Moses made mistakes. Gideon made mistakes. The Bible is not afraid to put our mistakes into the Word. Because it's when we read that as people who were close to God and yet still didn't quite discern God's will and purpose, that we actually begin to understand for ourselves that the process of understanding God's will is always going to be a struggle. It's never going to be that God's going to tell us directly what's there. It's never going to happen. God's not going to tell you all the answers. Because in fact, if He told you all the answers, how would that grow your relationship with Him? Rather, he wants us to see that. And that's why when we read these stories, when we read the prophets, let's not read them uncritically either. Let's struggle with those words and let's struggle with the writers. The book of Haggai really focuses on the second temple. And you can imagine that Haggai really is really part of that stream of Judaism that want to restore the cultic nature of Judaism. They want to restore that stream of the temple and sacrifice and showing the particular presence of God in the temple. As I said to you before, though, that there's another stream that's now continuing parallel, and that's the rabbinical stream. We need to also remember that not everybody, not all the Jews came back to Israel. Not all the Jews wanted to come back to Judah and reestablish the nation of Israel. Many of them have now lived outside of Israel for 60 years. Many of them are in Asia Minor or in Egypt or in fact in the whole of the Middle East. They don't come back. They continue to practice Judaism not with sacrifice but through that rabbinical stream. And it's that process that we see, whereas Haggai is very much a representative of that other stream, that stream of wanting to reestablish sacrifice, of wanting to reestablish that cultic framework. And then lastly we have Malachi. And Malachi is also again a book of hope, a book looking forward to the time of the coming of the Messiah, the coming of someone who would take them out of the backwater that they are and show them again to the world as being the ones who have been blessed and chosen by God. It's him who talks about Elijah as the forerunner of that process, that Elijah will come and will actually become the one who prepares the way for this Messiah. And of course, in the New Testament, we grab hold of that in the person of John the Baptist, and how John the Baptist is the forerunner of Jesus, of speaking to that process, of actually getting people to reconnect again with law, to reconnect again with Torah, and so blaze the trail for Jesus. Now, of course, there's two prophets that we haven't dealt with, and the two prophets particularly is Joel and Jonah. Joel and Jonah. And the reason why we've left those two out until this point is because it's very hard to date both of those books. There's lots of debate and really no consensus as to when those two books were written. Some argue for an early date, some argue for a very late date. What we need to look at is that Joel gives you very little information as to when it was particularly written. But what it is about restoration. The story of Joel, the prophecy of Joel is that the locusts have come and eaten everything, but God will respond. Well, God will restore the people. Joel is also used to deal with the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit really begins to be a driving force within the concept of Joel, which argues for a later writing, a time when in fact the Judeans have become associated with other cultures that believe in spirits. Whereas in the earlier part of the Tanakh, the Holy Spirit isn't anywhere near as prominent as Joel would make him out to be. In Jonah, Jonah is really more a parable than a prophecy. The parables of, again, saying that God sends us to our enemies. And so Jonah is a wonderful book of realizing that when Jesus says, love your enemies, do good to those who hurt you, he again is not coming up with something new, but rather Jonah is asked to do just that. He's asked to go to Nineveh, the capital city of Assyria, the enemy. He's told to go to them and preach to them so that they may convert and so not be destroyed. Of course, Jonah doesn't want to do that because, like most of us want to do with our enemies, we want them to be destroyed. We don't want to love our enemies and do good to those who hurt us. We want to hurt them back. And so again, what we see is that when Jesus speaks into the lives of the people in the New Testament, and in fact continues to speak into our lives, he's not coming up with a new gospel, new good news. Rather, what he's doing is he's just reconnecting with the news that already exists in Torah and in Nevi'im, in the law and the prophets.